So you've now learned that epics, or chansons de geste, kind of operate like the medieval version of a Hollywood action movie. I like that clip. Well, I like the Terry Jones documentaries anyway because they're entertaining and funny, but also usually pretty historically accurate, as Terry Jones was very keen on medieval history. But also because it's really hard for me to explain to students how um, literature was so performative in the Middle Ages compared to today, and that it would have been set to music and sung rather than spoken. And what I like about that video clip is they actually have somebody performing it the way it should have sounded back then. So the quote on the right hand side is actually a translation of what that guy in the video was singing. So this is what it looks like now, but you've just seen what it would actually have sounded like to people at the time. So the chansons de geste date from the 11th and the early 12th centuries. That was the heyday of them. They're also called songs of great deeds or the epics. They were hugely popular. So what these were epics of great heroic deeds, and as you heard, they were sung by minstrels. They followed on from an earlier tradition. If you've heard of Beowulf, it's kind of like a predecessor to the chansons de geste. The chansons are filled with battles, men fighting against huge odds. They basically embody the ideals of medieval noble society. And the best example of it is the Song of Roland. The Song of Roland recounts a fictional battle between Muslims and the men of Charlemagne. It's really basically very loosely based on the Battle of Tourpoitiers, which we've looked at several times before. That's the battle that when the Muslims from Spain were turned back by Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. So this Song of Roland tells of it, but it really tells us a lot more about attitudes towards Muslims during the period of the Crusades. You know, the Muslims are depicted as bad and pagans, and God is on the Christian side instead. So it tells us a lot about the Crusades and not the 8th century when it purports to have been set. We also have a form called lyric poetry, and this was a bit classier, sung by troubadours and court minstrels. They actually were probably borrowing from an earlier Muslim tradition that then filtered up through Spain. The lyric poetry reflects genteel nobility and new ideas about male and female love. Basically, the theme is usually unrequited love from afar or courtly love. Usually was pretty chaste, but sometimes it could be expressed more rudely or earthily. This probably did not rub off on medieval courts, but this form of poetry performed to music like the chansons de geste made a huge impact later, and it gave us a very rosy view of what chivalry, or the knight's code of conduct, actually was. Then we have the romance, which isn't terribly romantic at all. Instead, the romance was a long narrative that was concerned with love, based on stories from the past. So what today we might call a historical novel. The best example, the Tales of King Arthur. And I know you've all heard of King Arthur, even if it's the modern movie redoings of it. So King Arthur was a legendary 6th century British king, and he was transformed in the romances to a 12th century monarch surrounded by ladies and dashing knights going off on quests. His court was Camelot. It was filled with romantic love and religious sensibility. The knights worshipped ladies and they went on their daring quests, and it was all very nice and brave altogether. When feudal loyalty and love stand face to face, love wins. That's another theme of the romance. A good example of this is the tale Tristan and Isolde. Tristan loves Isolde, but she's the wife of his lord, King Mark of Cornwall. Despite this being okay in the romances and really, really popular, would not have gone down at all well at the time. And probably if you fell in love with your lord's wife, something like the picture on the right would happen to you. The romances instead play up knightly chivalry, what it meant to be a good chivalrous knight, like protecting the weak. The romances also stress Christian purity, dedication in the face of desire, honour, military prowess, and the ability to speak well. So obviously, these are going to be really, really popular for nobles, but not so much for the peasants. They're not featured in any of these tales. The only time peasants ever appear are cannon fodder. Well, they didn't have cannons at this time, but you know what I mean. They're just there to be killed. We don't actually have very many peasant tales surviving from the Middle Ages. It was mainly an oral tradition. So it means that today it survives as folklore, and that's really tough to trace. You might find it surprising that the Robin Hood tales are much later than the ones that I've just named to you. The first known reference to the rhymes of Robin Hood occurs in as late as 1377 within the B text of a very popular medieval book, William Langland's Piers Plowman. During the course of the next century, the earliest surviving Robin Hood ballads established the enduring themes of the saga. So again, these would have been set to music. It's only by 1500 that the Robin Hood hero, who's associated as being a really talented archer, he leads a band of merry men. By 1500, he had been transformed into a courteous and benign outlaw. Maid Marian might be interesting to know, is actually even later. I don't think she rocks up until the 17th century. She's a shepherdess called Clorinda before then. So the Robin Hood tales have changed an awful lot over time. Now, in the 13th century, towns produced plays that they put on for the townspeople as entertainment. And their favourite topics were saints' lives, morality stories, and the Bible. They were mainly performed by craft guilds. You remember them from your commerce Nearpod? Well, another name for the guild were the mystery. So these plays that were put on for the benefit of the townspeople were called mystery plays. So these were not mystery tales the way we consider them today. It's not like a whodunit. It's not an Agatha Christie. It's a play put on by a guild. It's not as exciting. So the guild actually used them as like free marketing. So they would put on a play that was pertinent to their guild. For example, the carpenters would always put on Noah's Ark so that they could show off how beautiful an ark they built and hopefully gain business out of it. Town plays also like the Fable and the Beast Epidemic. I said epidemic, but I hiccuped. The Fable or Beast Epic. These were popular because they could be, oh, sorry guys. They were pretty obscene. But they reflected real social relations at the time, and people wanted to see themselves reflected in their stories. You know, for example, a really popular theme in these tales were a churchman caught with a merchant's wife. Those were really, really popular. When we hit the 13th century, we reach one of the high points of medieval literature, Dante. He was the high point of poetry in the 13th century. Now, he started a craze for writing in Italian because he wrote in Tuscan, which was his regional dialect of Italian. And his very famous masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, was written in Tuscan. The Divine Comedy tells of a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise into the very presence of God. Basically, he writes about the whole medieval universe. He's also famous for putting all the people he doesn't like in various levels of hell. That includes popes and, of course, politicians. Now, turning to the vernacular English, Geoffrey Chaucer is probably the most famous of the medieval English writers, and he's often described as the founder of modern English poetry. Chaucer also reflects the rise of the middle class. So he is used as a very crucial witness to his times. He was living in the 1300s and so described a society that was transforming really rather rapidly, as we'll see next week. He led a very active professional life among kings and lords and princes. He adapted into the English language the themes, procedures, and vocabulary of the French and Italian poets. His most famous book is The Canterbury Tales. He's also well known for mixing up literary genres. So he does a mashup of chivalric romances, saints' lives, animal fables, etc. And he mixes it up with the upwardly mobile, the middle class, and he also adds in a lot of debates on current topics like the role of women, the power of money, and issues in religious hypocrisy. His characters are not perfect. They have plenty of their own vices, as well as their good qualities. He's very interested instead in reflecting humanity for all its good and bad. And Chaucer narrates their adventures with humour and charity. Meanwhile, although he touches and pokes and needles at some really big topics of the day, he does avoid all extremism. He criticizes the church and pokes at it, but he carefully avoids open opposition to the church and the dogma. this video is going to stop now, and instead you're going to watch a little video clip about Chaucer. It's going to link us to next week's class really well. It's also going to talk about the dirty bits.